Welcome back, everybody. In a moment, I will invite President Stoichev back to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Malinda Smith. Before I do that, however, I wish to introduce Dr. Verna St. Denis, who will moderate the question and answer period immediately following Dr. Smith's keynote. Dr. Verna St. Denis is both a professor in educational foundations and special advisor to the President on anti-racism, anti-oppression. Dr. Denis is a member of Beardy's and Okamasas First Nation and grew up as a non-status Indian and Métis in the Parkland region of Saskatchewan. Her scholarship has advanced anti-racist education, and she is in high demand to provide professional education and training for schools and other educational organizations. She is also a friend and colleague of Dr. Smith's, and we're delighted to have her moderate the question and answer following the keynote. At this time, I now welcome back University of Saskatchewan President, Dr. Peter Stoichev, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks very much, Kelly. And good afternoon, colleagues. We're very fortunate now, you'll see what I mean, to have the opportunity to hear from our keynote guest speaker, Dr. Malinda Smith. And I wanted to say a few things about her, just so that you understand her background and her many, many accomplishments. It's just really, really wonderful that we've been able to secure her for this very important event. Dr. Smith is the University of Calgary's first ever Vice Provost of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. She was appointed to the position in August of 2020, just over a year ago, following an extensive search to fill that new role. She has made the move south to the University of Calgary from Edmonton, where she had been serving as a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta. Her areas of research and teaching there included international and comparative politics, critical race studies, and gender and politics. She also served as Vice Provost in Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Policy in the Office of the Provost at the University of Alberta. As the University of Calgary's inaugural Vice Provost EDI, Dr. Smith is responsible for providing leadership on issues of human rights, diversity, inclusion, and equity, for working closely with stakeholders across the campus, and also for promoting institutional and community EDI goals. Dr. Smith is a nationally recognized leader in EDI work. She's highly regarded for her contributions to developing next generation equity policies, including for her work on several task force reports, as well as for advisory roles in the post-secondary sector and at various levels of government. So you can see how incredibly pertinent it is for her to be speaking to us today. Dr. Smith is a 2018 Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow. Her research has focused on unearthing stories of hidden Black figures in Canadian higher education law and politics. She also serves on Statistics Canada's expert working group on Black communities in Canada and on immigration and ethnocultural statistics. As the first person of color to serve on the executive of the Canadian Federation of the Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Smith worked to embed EDI in Congress programming. She's also contributed to EDI initiatives in national granting agencies, including the Dimensions EDI Charter and the Canada Research Chair's Programs Advisory Committee on EDI Policy. Dr. Smith is the co-author of The Equity Myth, Racialization and Indigeneity at Canadian Universities, and as well the editor or co-editor of 6 books and numerous articles and book chapters. She's received numerous awards and honors, including most recently the Rosalind Smith Professional Award and the Susan S. Northcutt Award in 2020. She also earned the ISA Canada Distinguished Scholar Award in 2018-19, and she was awarded the University of Alberta's EDI Award in 2018. Born and raised in the Bahamas, Dr. Smith earned 2 master's degrees at Western Michigan University, specializing in development administration and political science, and also earned a PhD in international relations and political philosophy at the University of Alberta. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Malinda Smith.
Good afternoon, and thank you, President Stoichev, for that fabulous introduction. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much to Dr. Verna Denis and to all of those who have participated in inviting me to speak to you today. Before I begin, my presentation and sharing my screen, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Calgary, which is the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tustisina First Nations and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and Wesley's First Nations. The city of Calgary, as some of you may know, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So it's my privilege to speak to you this afternoon. If you'll give me a minute, I will share my screen and hopefully help contribute to a conversation that I know you have been engaged in for some time. So my presentation is entitled From Talk to Action, Charting Equitable Futures in the Canadian Academy. And following your theme, I'd like to speak to the questions from policy to implementation as well. So one of the issues we are faced with in our universities, in leadership in particular, is how do we move from talk to action? We've had over 3 decades of engaging with voluntary affirmative action, voluntary equity initiatives, employment equity initiatives. And now we have shifted to this language of equity, diversity, inclusion. So I want to just highlight this quote here that you see, and I hope you can see it, from Rashid Ogunlade, which is to say, in leadership, life in all things, it's far wiser to judge people by their deeds and their speech, their track record, than their talk. And so one of the questions we are faced with today is, if we were to judge universities by their track record in the area of EDI, how would we judge them? How would we evaluate our performance? How would we evaluate our contributions? And so part of what I want to do in this presentation is to talk about this journey from talk to action. But I also want to say we're having this conversation in the context of some significant events. I'm here in Calgary, which just had a historic election where we elected 2 South Asian mayors in Calgary and Edmonton, but also several women mayors across the province, and a number of women and racialized minorities and a few Indigenous peoples to city council. That's historic. What I would say is, with that great that is part of what I call a great social transformation in Canada, which I think sometimes the politicians, university leaders, corporate board leaders, nonprofit leaders, but certainly the media miss. When I say a great transformation, Alberta is a classic example. Many people don't know, for example, that the city of Calgary and Edmonton, there are over 35 to 36% of the populations are racialized minorities, primarily Chinese, South Asian, Filipino, and Black. And those are only 2 of there are 3 other cities in Alberta with larger racialized minority population, young population, on average the youngest in Canada, and also a population which is coexisting with as I said, the Indigenous people who have been here for time immemorial. That great social transformation gets missed by people focusing on other kinds of things. So I'll give you a couple of examples to say to you why I think there's a fierce urgency, not just in Alberta, but I would think across the prairies, to deal with the challenge of equity, diversity, inclusion, and to deal with it in universities as important to addressing the growing equity gap, the diversity gap, but also in some ways a polarization that's occurring in our societies, which I think universities are uniquely positioned to address. So I remind people when I talk about Alberta and my own experiences here, while I spent most of my career as the only Black woman in political science, that changed. And then the only Black woman full professor, that changed. There are now 3 of us. There's still less than about 7 or 10 of us. I spent almost every committee I've been on nationally, but also at the University of Alberta, of course, I've been the only one. And that's that kind of isolation, that kind of lack of diversity. If you want to put it the other way, the homogeneity on the other side, I think has shaped my approach to equity, diversity, inclusion, but also in a way, my impatience with the slow pace of change. And so I stress there's an urgency. And this is not unique because Alberta had its first civil rights case as early as record as 1914 with Charles Daniels, then later Lulu Anderson. These are 1914 and 1922, pushing to end segregation in theaters. We had the first Black woman in Canada elected 1954, first Black Canadian-born Black judge, Lionel Jones in Edmonton, first Muslim mayor in North America, Nahid Nenshi. Now we might be one of the few Canadian cities where you have 2 South Asians falling back to back on city council. We also have a South Asian now head of city council in Edmonton. These things aren't unique to Alberta. The person's case was in Alberta. Delvin Wren case on gay rights came out of Alberta. The prairies is the fastest growing Black population. The Black Indigenous relationships has been longstanding, as in, I would say, often under-examined Black as Indigenous Sikh relations, Indigenous Japanese relations, Indigenous Chinese relations. This, I'm highlighting what I see as a moment where these kinds of conversations are able. But these are taking place in the context of a global pandemic and all the discussions around vaccine hesitancy, around all the conversations around the experiences of grief, which are playing out in social media. They're taking place in the context of the long shut of the residential schools, which seem novel to politicians and some people, but Indigenous people have been pointing out this reality for some time. And I would say that while we're talking about reconciliation and in relation, say, to equity, because there are in some instances, people see these as competing interests in universities. I see these as complementary interests. There's rather than zero sum. I think it's actually important to highlight that we've only started to even take seriously Indigenous peace experiences in the academy with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, not the Employment Equity Act, but reconciliation. And so the question is, what's taking us so long as universities? We are in the aftermath, the afterlives of the student-led Black Lives Matter mobilization and global reckoning. Some says that global reckoning has fizzled out. What have Canadian universities done to address anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Indigenous racisms, to deal with the complexities of oppression intersecting, including sexual violence and gender-based violence? In this midst of this great social transformation that we are witnessing, unfolding not just in Alberta, but across the country, which I think is underemphasized, where we are witnessing not just diversity, but hyperdiversity and super diversity, where we don't just talk about South Asians, but we talk about the complexities within South Asians, from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Trinidad and Guyana. We talk about South Asians who are, if it wasn't for Columbus getting lost, would be called Indians in Canada, except Columbus did get lost. And so we now have this phenomenon globally of South Asians as Indians, Indigenous peoples as Indians, and then in the Caribbean, West Indians, because again, this legacy of colonialism that persists. We should not take for granted the rise of the far right. the alt-right or conspiracy theories. The far right, the tiki torch, neo-Nazis are on the rise. I think underemphasized by politicians, in fact, ignored by politicians, or minimized or trivialized by politicians and inadequately addressed by the police. The far right is fueling suggesting that diversity is white genocide, that anti-racism is anti-diversity. And I see very little effort to grapple with this discursive terrain, but also the implications of it. So now we see the same groups, far right, conspiracy theorists talking about the great social transformation. They use the language of the great replacement, or that following Renard Camus, the French nationalist, claiming that the immigration, for example, is concerned with replacing white people. This need for racial reckoning is serious, is intertwined with the far right. We cannot dismiss these rhetoric as simply academic freedom or free speech, because they are toxic to the very democracy. They are toxic to the very universities we inhabit. We also see with the return to course to the campuses, the typical youth, we could say youth foolishness in actions, but also sexual and gender-based violence, which are serious and harmful and persistent. And we know that during the pandemic, that domestic violence was on the rise. So that remains a huge issue. We are also in the context of climate mobilization. And then we have a whole generation of young people, from kindergarten to elementary school, to junior high school, to high school, to universities, who are the pandemial generation. They started all of these journeys in their academic pipelines and pathways in the context of pandemic. These kindergarten pictures will forever show their first day at classes with a mask on. What will be the implications for the pandemic generation? So we're thinking about academic pipelines and pathways. I think we need to be really attentive to the impact of the pandemic of COVID-19, not just on these new generations, but also on those of us in the academy who have now been under the shadow of this pandemic for over 2 years. And I am deeply worried about the toll it's taking on people, mentally and physically, because it's been persistent and there's been little room to address these kinds of things, certainly in a social sense. So we are here today to talk about from talk to action. How do we go from equity talk to walking the equity walk? How do we go from not just in universities, but also in schools as well? I think a huge factor is leadership. When I say leadership, yes, I mean senior leadership, and which I'm a part, but I'm one person, one Black person in the entire student leadership. So that isolation that I experienced as a graduate student, as an assistant professor, continues in my own personal journey, my biography. But my biography is not a response to systemic change. So even those of us who were individuals, Indigenous, racialized, queer, women, one of us is not going to change the system. So it begs the question to shift away from the individual to the systemic. What do we need to do? Again, I say senior leadership, but I also think the boards of governors, I think senates, I think general faculties councils, I think university unions, they all play a role. And if all of these groups are not in conversations with the postdocs and the graduate students and the undergraduate students, we're going to have some significant events, some significant activities, but we won't have the necessary systemic change that we need. To actually move from talk to action, we need to think about transforming systems. And the question is, what does that require us to do? So one of the people I turn to is the historian, the late historian, Tony Judd. And I'm inspired by Tony Judd, who said that one of the difficult, so what is it about us that we have this difficulty even imagining a different sort of society from one whose dysfunction and inequities trouble us so? So you'd be hard pressed to find people who say that they are not troubled by inequities. They're not troubled by racism, but they're not troubled by the gender inequities that persist. That they're not concerned about the lack of accessibility. That they're not concerned about the persistent Indigenous injustices and the neocolonial relations, or the continuing colonial relations experienced. So if that is true, what are the obstacles that come in our way that prevent us from mobilizing in a way that will lead to our common advantage? Judd thought part of the issue was discursive. We don't even know how to talk about these kinds of things, he said. I think the language of EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, the language of EDIA, all matter. So I want to start with Judd, but I also want to give a couple of quotes from Abella and then move into my discussion more fulsomely. So we know that the journey around employment equity begins in a way with it doesn't begin, but it culminates in a way with, in terms of the policy mobilization with the Royal Commission on Equality and Employment, the Abella report. And I say we know, but sometimes I go over this because I think some people don't know. And they don't know how Abella distinguishes employment equity, say, from affirmative action in the United States. And what Abella argued in that Royal Commission, which I think is true today, is that individuals in the designated groups are unable to achieve equality on their own. So this idea of the individual journey, this heroic individual overcoming systemic barriers or structural barriers, it's unlikely. An individual may move through the system, but to have collective systemic change, we actually need to be proactive. We actually need to be intentional. We actually need to intervene. So inequality, Abella said in '84, will not happen unless we intervene to make it happen. And the question that we face in terms of moving from policy to action, or from talk to action, is to look at the interventions we have made or not made as a basis for understanding why we continue to be in conditions of inequity. And when we start to talk about the systemic change, is where we see the obstacles, what Sarah Med called the brick walls that just come in our way. We see the excuses and the rationalizations. We see the claims, oh, wait, defer. And then we see how power plays out, which is to say, there's the pie is not big enough to share, or we have to have either Indigenous engagement or racialized, or dealing with the Scarborough Charter on anti-Black racism, or dealing with gender equity, which suggests that justice can be deferred to the future for some people. Now, if we thought about that, who could sit around a table and make a decision that says some people can live in conditions of inequity, and we who make decisions in universities can defer equitable experiences to the future? If we sat with that thought, would we be so clear about saying we are committed to equity, diversity, inclusion, to welcoming campuses? Who can make that decision about who should experience equity and who should live in conditions of disadvantage? Yet, by not intervening, Abella said, it's intolerable It's insensitive. It's a hope and wait or hope and prayer scenario. Equality in employment will not happen unless we make it happen. Abella was clear, and I think she could have written this in 2021. She retired in 2021. It's not just that it's inconvenient, it's unfair that some people are restricted in opportunities. It's unfair that people are limited in decision-making, that our leadership, university leaderships are so homogenous. That doesn't happen by accident. It's not because of availability. So the question then is, why does it persist? Why have we not had more than a handful of women presidents? Why is it that we can't have racialized presidents except, I think at one point the peak was 7? What's going on with our processes that we can't move from the policy on the playbook, the ad in the statement in the ad, we are committed to equity, diversity, inclusion. Why can't we move from that to action, to actually seeing results? What it means then is that some groups have circumscribed range of options, identified those groups as women, visible minorities, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous peoples. And then subsequently, we have started to added a fifth indent, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. So this is about standards. And the bill said that this is a standard of unfairness. It's not about instrumental, we would like a little diversity because it's nice. Equity is about ameliorating unfairness. It's about ameliorating disadvantage. It is about righting wrongs. It is about correcting the imbalance. So let me say more about the equity alphabet. So is equity, have to move from equity as a misunderstanding. Oh, you don't understand what we're trying to do. Or as a topic at a conference, for example, or as a recommendation in some kind of strategic plan or policy report. How do we get from equity as a misunderstanding or a topic to equity as foundation? Which is to say, is fundamental to the institution. Is it a pillar or is it the foundation? I think that the inability to understand how we think about, so back to Tony Judd, how we think about what equity is about is part of the problem. We need to be clear about whether this is something that's important or whether it's something that's part of a checkbox. It's a little recommendation we have over here. It's a little statement on our website. It's a little rider on our job ads. It's just a topic we have a conversation about at all of our national meetings, but really it doesn't change anything. So how do we move beyond equity as, a misunderstanding or a statement or this, to thinking about it? Again, back to Tony Judd, part of our issue is we use the acronym and we don't unpack what each institution means by that acronym. So employment equity, what do we mean by that? Employment fairness. We say we're going to move the barriers, but how? An unconscious bias workshop? Well, that hasn't succeeded, has it? So what are our policies? What are our mechanisms for monitoring? Do we have a policy that says, do we even have data? Do we know who gets shortlisted? Do we know who applies, who gets shortlisted, who gets invited for an interview, who gets appointed? If we are not collecting data to assess that, we can't make any claims about whether we are improving or not, because we have no basis, no evidence for doing so. So I'll come back to this point about data is important, but employment equity requires us to do things, requires us to act in order to affect certain outcomes. Diversity term, I think is actually became a problem for equity because diversity, then people thought, oh, we have a handful of, we have so-and-so over here, we have Malinda, who's, oh, she's Black woman, look at that. That led to, I think, a kind of tokenism, if not intended, the outcome. It led to a shift away from the important value of this is about ameliorating systemic disadvantage, not for an individual. So autobiographical solutions to systemic problems don't work. The inclusive turn also shifted our focus. Everybody's using the language, inclusive leadership, inclusive universities, inclusive communities. What does that mean? Who gets to include? That's a question of power. Include into what? Are we including people into a system or university that hasn't changed, where they will experience inequities, where they may experience harassment and discrimination, and there are no policies or processes to deal with it? Inclusion requires action, proactive action, and it requires somebody responsible for following that around to see what's being done. To get around this conundrum of the acronym, we've seen EDI, there's a lot of disparagement of EDI. There's some people talk about the EDI Inc., which is to say, the lack of action in the area of equity, diversity, inclusion has led to extraordinary cynicism about EDI. People don't even want to hear it because they think it is just a shell game for universities to say they're doing something when very little changes. I get this all the time. People say, oh no, that's not personal, Malinda. You know, we appreciate what you're trying to do, but you are one person. Where's the infrastructure to affect the kind of change that we're talking about? So some say it's about justice, the JETI approach. Some says READY, that equity never really included racial equity. It didn't include disability justice. It didn't include LGBTQ2+. It didn't include Indigenous. Equity in the 1980s and 90s primarily centered on gender equity, and that is still the predominant approach in universities. And the EDIA is to highlight that equity really addressed questions of accessibility. And disabilities were seen as perhaps seeing eye dog or visual disabilities, but not, for example, deaf culture. We still haven't taken seriously our commitment to diversity. So here we are. It begs the question, how well do we understand the vocabulary of diversity and inclusion that we are using? So as I said, if diversity is the mix, what are we mixing? What's in the mix? Who decides? Is it faculty, staff, students? Where are they in the mix? How is the mix how's the mix working? Or do we have segregation? Or do we have integration? Or do we just have marginalization? What is our evidence for any of this? Who's keeping track? So Verna Meyer says diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Actually, so inclusion then should be about engagement. It should be about participation. It should be about having a seat at the table. Well, when we look at our decision-making tables, our chairs, our associate deans, our deans, our vice deans, our vice presidents, our provosts, our presidents, do we see inclusion? Where do we see the inclusion? Is it in our students, undergraduate and graduate? Most universities don't even have data on their students. They don't even know how diverse their student population is, except for international students, which is very interesting. So where is the evidence to suggest the claims we make? To move from talk and policy to action, we need data. So do we have, and we see people put these all around, what's in a word or acronym beyond the acronym EDID, DI? Do we want, are we talking about inclusion as power, voice, organizational cultural change? It's really important for universities in order to move from policy to action to fully understand when that acronym is deployed, whatever acronym, equity, diversity, inclusion, equity, diversity, inclusion, decolonization. And I'll be happy to answer any questions for decolonization later. It really needs to be handled. I mean, it needs to be, the university needs to be clear of what's the institutional understanding of it, how it operationalizes that, and then how it seeks to have an outcome. So who is here, but are we using their knowledge and talents? Are you given a plate of food, or you get to choose the food you want? What do you have? What do you do? So equity is about doing. In this conference, these sessions are about doing, about the action. So I briefly mentioned the Royal Commission on Equality in Employment, the Employment Equity Act, the Federal Contracts Practice Program, EDID. Let me just say to you why I'm concerned about the conversations we're having in 2021. It was in 1985 that we're talking about not denying a person opportunities of benefit and ability. It was in 85 where every employer should implement employment equity, have a policy. 85 where we said they should collect data and conduct an analysis of the workforce, and that data should include a review of the employer's system, so employment equity policies. What are the employees for what are the policies for hiring faculty members? What are the policies for hiring? Are there cluster hires, target hires possible? What are the policies for hiring deans? So for example, we are in the process of changing ours at the University of Calgary. One of the criterion is you have to be a tenured professor. Well, if racialized and Indigenous people and LGBTQ people are untenured, it means they still can't be on committees. Is that necessary to qualifications or knowledge that you have to be a tenured professor? So there are some archaic aspects of these hiring practices that need to be evaluated and addressed for outcomes to change. And if they're not doing it, then there's a pattern of continuity. So what are the barriers? In whether at University of Alberta or here or Athabasca before that, people use barriers as if it's one size fits all. Are the barriers for racialized women the same as the barriers for Indigenous women? Are the barriers for persons with disabilities the same, even within disabilities group? If you have invisible disabilities, for example, if you have a physical disability, is it the same as if you had a visual disability? Obviously not. So what does it mean? So at the University of Calgary, one of the things I'm trying to facilitate is equitable. How do we understand equitable pathways for each of the equity deserving groups? And when we try to do that, we see the limits, the data we have, the policies we have, and the processes we have for each of the equity groups. But if that had started in 1985 as it was supposed to, we would be in a different place. So here's what the Federal Contractors Program required universities to do. Create accountability mechanisms. That's right, that gets us from policy to change, from policy to action. Have a senior official responsible. So it's only now we see in the last 5 years, maybe 10 years, that universities are appointing a senior lead for EDI or EDIA. It's only now, because racism, racial equity was not taken seriously, that we see advisors on anti-racism and inclusive excellence, advisors on anti-racism and anti-oppression. We now see in discussions about Black action plans. And it begs the question, how do these emerging things, which should have happened in '86 and earlier, relate to this larger vision of an equitable, diverse, and inclusive university? Have we communicated to the employees and employment our vision, the university's vision? Is the university collecting voluntary self-ID data through a questionnaire? That was a question in 1986. So it is worth asking why in 2021, we are still just having this conversation. Do we analyze workforce data, identify barriers, develop goals to decrease gaps, adopt positive, proactive measures? Proactive measures are in the Human Rights Act. They are also in the Charter. They are Section 15 of the Charter. They are permitted by law, and yet there's an urban legend that they're not. Do we have monitoring systems to track progress? So if we are University of Saskatchewan, University of Calgary, Alberta, wherever we are, when we are faced with this continuum, what would we say about where we are located? Are we people still in denial, or are they doing compliance? Well, the CRC program requires me to do this. Oh, well, we signed off on this, so we will do this. So it's compliance-based. Some are moving beyond compliance with strategic hires here, cluster hires there. But by and large, most institutions are 3 or lower. In the case of equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility. And I think I would hold off on saying decolonization. The language, as Eve Tuck points out, is often used as a metaphor. So the research is clear. The equity myth, as you know, was one of the co-authors on that. But we also have COUT, underrepresented and underpaid. We have the diversity gap research, which also looked at Canada Research Chairs, Canada Excellence Research Chairs, Canada 150 chairs, and the gaps in those. And we have the Universities Canada report on equity, diversity, inclusion. There is no shortage of evidence documenting persistent inequities. And their universities have not done the self-assessments to see whether the representational gaps or the pay gaps. Some have done maybe the gender wage gap. I know of none who have actually looked, well, except for one actually. When I viewed at the University of Alberta, the Faculty Association did a look at racialized gap, an Indigenous gap, and tried to disabilities. But that was not, that was out without institutional support. Equity requires that we look at each of these things for each of the equity deserving groups. When you start to see these questions, you see why the whole idea that one individual in an office can do this large scale research, institutional analysis, in order to affect appropriate changes, policies, action, is impossible. We need an infrastructure for this. Universities are the size of cities. Realistically speaking, what can we expect with an individual here and there doing this difficult work? On representation, from the equity myth, we found that on the representation, on institutional, organizational culture, on mechanisms for equity and inclusion, so this infrastructure that I'm talking about, there was a gap between what universities were saying in their discourses, on their websites, in their brochures, in their recruitment activities, about their commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. We welcome diversity. And then you say, okay, where's the welcome mat? Why am I experiencing microaggressions? Why am I experiencing efforts to push me out? Why can't I get opportunities for research funds or chairs or other things? Why are these limited to individuals selected? These questions, these hard questions, draw our attention to the challenges of moving from policy to action. But that in order to affect change, meaningful change, we actually need to take a hard look at each of these kinds of things: representation, institutional culture, including the culture of leadership, which is to say, in some ways, self-perpetuating, the structures of it, and the mechanisms. You see COUT's underrepresented and underpaid highlight the challenges of even the women plateaued at the sandwich, where I call that sandwich generation of associate professors. Well, if we are serious about equity, and if we want more women to be in leadership, for example, or more women to get Tier 1 Canada Research Chairs, or more women to get these big Killam fellowships and so on, so to enhance diversity in the research ecosystem, we ask you to say, okay, so why are women plateauing? How are we thinking about career trajectories? How are we thinking about how we evaluate people for tenure and promotion? How are we thinking about even citational practices? I said, do we use DORA, for example, or do we use the H-index? How are we evaluating research and scholarship? Those questions are important for how we think about a whole array of approaches to knowledges, decolonizing knowledges, but also how we think of different ways of knowing, as Indigenous scholars have reminded us persistently. So these questions, I'm here highlighting gender here, but we can think about women in STEM, we can think about Indigenous people in STEM, we can think about each of these questions in terms of the underrepresented and underpaid and undervalued, and see why the challenge of moving from talk to action. Data gap, my own research I've pointed out the leadership diversity gap. I see very little change. And in fact, at one point, I coined the language of diversifying whiteness. And I use that mindfully, which is to say, that universities have shifted from saying, okay, we are from gender, we're going to try and get a little bit of gender equity, maybe gender parity. And then they shift to, oh, well, we're going to diversify gender. We're going to talk about genders. We're going to highlight lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. The obstacle and barrier to thinking about racialized minority, racial equity, about grappling with the thorny issue of anti-racism. I can count on one hand the times I've heard university leaders talk about racial equity, that have difficult conversations with leaderships around the table about achieving racial justice. Not because it's nice or being beneficent or benevolent, because, as Abella said, this disadvantage is patently unfair. It's unjust, it's wrong. Now, some people said, oh, we need to be more instrumental, we can't use this moral language. It's also a human rights language. No human being should be treated in a way that devalues their humanity, that devalues their human dignity. And inequity in this sense, denying people who are qualified, who experience opportunities, is a way of demeaning their very humanity. And that's the legacies of slavery, it's the legacies of continuing colonialism, it's the legacies of systemic inequities, and we must take a hard look at it, because these kind of data are not possible. They are not possible if a systematic effort was being made to monitor the data, to identify gaps, to develop strategies to close those gaps and to monitor them. We would not be in 2021 looking at this kind of data and saying, why is it that we have these kinds of numbers in Canada, of all places? Not the United States, not Brazil, not South Africa. This is Canada. If we took equity seriously, we should not be having these kinds of numbers. Where are the leaders? Senior leaders like myself, senior leaders like President Stoichkov, where are the leaders saying, this is untenable, that in 2021, we are facing these kinds of things? That I looked at, I thought, well, okay, maybe I need to look lower. The deans maybe will be a little bit more diverse. Deans are no more diverse. And according to this study by Fuji Johnson and Houswan, 2020 said that racialized women and men hit the ceiling at the level of associate deans. Indigenous peoples aren't even on the table, and few people are collecting data on persons with disabilities. So we aren't even monitoring the gaps. So if you're not monitoring the gaps, if you're not developing initiatives to close the gaps, how can we expect to have change? We can't. We're not serious about that. So what we do have better data on is the status of women. And because that's administrative data rather than self-ID data. Every time a person applies for a student or to be a hiring, they check a box. Often it's binary, but increasingly people are changing so that people can have a non-binary options, and they could have preferred names or self-affirming names. So we have this data. We now need to call for, say, whether through Universities Canada, whether through U15, call for the federal government, call for Statistics Canada to modernize the USask system, which presents data on women and age, to include each of the equity deserving group. So we can say, have this kind of data for each equity deserving group: women, racialized minorities, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. This figure, this is from Universities Canada, said most universities don't have a strategy. Most are in development. I will be truthful and say ours is in development. But it tells you if it's only in development now, what have we been doing for the previous 30 years? So in sum, we need data. I said we need student data. You can't talk about closing the gaps for students, mentoring, improving the student experience for racialized or Indigenous students, unless you know who they are, where they are, their experiences. You develop policies and programs and supports and services in order to improve those experiences, but you need to know who they are. That knowledge informs policymaking. The policymaking, the strategies to close the gaps lead to action. And the action includes monitoring, and then so it's a cycle of continuous learning. We are in universities, our EDI plans, our EDI strategies, our EDI approaches, our actions should reflect the commitment to lifelong learning and a commitment to a cycle of improvement. So we need to go from talk to action. That's the focus of this con. And if I can summarize some of the issues we face, I know we are probably time strapped a little bit here. One of the reasons why I think we are in this conundrum in 2021, which is like 30 years of employment equity, is one, we don't understand the why. We think it's we could be doing this because we want to be nice, or we want a little bit of diversity, or a little bit of a difference. The diversity is an outcome of equity. It is not the outcome in and of itself. It is an outcome of ameliorating disadvantage, of removing barriers, of removing biases that impede the ability of equity deserving groups to flourish in the economy. It's not just about them entering the economy. We want members of these groups to thrive, to excel, to innovate, to be creative, to fulfill their potentials. That is the language we need to be thinking about. Nobody's doing this because we want to be nice. We focus on diversity. We have some of those here. We have little programs over here, affinity groups there. That's important for people surviving, not necessarily for people thriving. We need to move barriers. We need to focus on activities. We have all these initiatives, speaker series, guest speakers, all kinds of things. And the question, and I participate in all these kinds of things. I facilitate all these things. They will not change systems by themselves. They will change consciousness maybe for some people in that moment, but not for everybody. But systems require a much more serious intervention. They require, as Abel said, equality in employment will not happen unless we make it happen. We'll extend that. Equality or equity in education, as the student experience, the postdoc experience, will not happen unless we make it happen. So today, for example, at University of Calgary, we launched our inaugural Indigenous and Black postdoctoral scholars with the aim of ensuring that talented scholars in those groups are able to come to the University of Calgary, conduct their research, flourish, and then move through. So we are creating the next generation of scholars, intervening directly. It can't be a responsibility of one person, one advisor, no resources, no budget, isolated from structures or systems, not connected to, say, the provost team or the president's team or the board of governors. That's a recipe for marginality, for a recipe for burnout. The research is clear enough on that. We need to do better. So a big obstacle I found in my own experience is when you raise the problem, and especially if you're visible and you're proactive, people perceive you as the problem. Sarah Mead has highlighted this herself in on being included, her book on being included, and her work on complaint. That when people raise the problem, they be seen as troublemakers, they get marginalized. And even people who think they are for equity, diversity, inclusion are just as likely to marginalize them because everybody wants to be associated with the popular people or the successful people, not the people who are raising thorny issues. So despite all of our conversations about commitment to diversity perspectives, about academic freedom, we actually don't speak up as often as we should when questions of injustice, unfairness occur even in our midst, because people are afraid that it would lead to them being marginalized in one sense, or because they don't want to be seen as the problem. So again, I said lack of infrastructure, failure to connect individual issues to systemic issues, but the other side of that, as I said, is autobiographical solutions. We cannot keep using autobiographical solutions to systemic problems. So one individual who is Indigenous, or one individual who is a woman, or one individual who is racialized are not going to solve systemic problems. And the very idea of putting the weight of the institution of history on an individual is itself a reflection of this inequity. So in the equity myth, I highlight what I call the dirty dozen biases and barriers that impede people's movement along that pipeline and pathways. I won't go into all of them, but the main point of doing this is to say, we need to be systematic. We need to have research informed. We need to have evidence-driven approaches to how we think, and even how we hire, how we admit students into undergraduate programs. I say to my people who are in graduate chairs, how diverse is your graduate student pool? Because that's the next generation of academics, of alt leaders out there. So if that pool of master's and PhD students aren't diverse, you're not socializing the next generation of leaders. So if they leak out at the undergraduate level, then something needs to be done to intervene. You can think about who speaks, who gets invited to conferences, who we can think about citational practices, who do we cite. We can think of all kinds of things about people moving up the pipeline into leadership, who gets tapped, who gets mentored, who gets sponsored. And so the research is clear about this. Women end up doing the housewifely work of the academy. That phrase is very, and there's a kind of structural ingratitude, which is to say, women do this work. And the assumption is they like doing this service work. That's not the kind of work, even though it requires leadership, even though it requires ingenuity, even though it requires practical skills. That's not the communication skills. That's not the kind of leadership that gets one to move up the pipeline to vice dean or dean or to university leadership. So we need to think about those leadership pipelines and how we are cultivating those in the academy. So let me end here. We want to build equitable futures. We want to move from talk to action. We want to move from policy to implementation. It requires that we do some concrete kinds of things. I suggested in my talk that the initiatives outlined in the federal contractors program actually are some of the same things being reiterated today, including in the CRC program, including in Dimensions EDI program to facilitate EDI in the research ecosystem. There's no shortage of knowledge on what needs to be done. There's a shortage of willpower. And there's a shortage of leadership. And there's a shortage of infrastructure to get it done. We put the weight of this change on the very people who have been harmed and marginalized by it. And for action, we need to change that. We also need to be attentive to data. We say we are evidence-driven, we are research-informed, evidence-driven. Universities of all places, especially U15, Saskatchewan, Calgary, Alberta, UBC, all of us, we are research-intensive institutions. Yet we don't do research on ourselves. We don't do research on inequities on ourselves. In order to change the inequities in a way that's sustainable and in a way that we can all thrive, we actually do the research, we actually collect the data, and we actually develop strategies to intervene to close this gap, and we need monitoring mechanisms. Now think about that as institutional analysis and what kind of expertise we need. And we got all kinds of economists, sociologists, political scientists, policy people who could do this work. The question is, have we mobilized them to support the change? Or have we relied on appointing one or two high-profile individuals? And whether that is sufficient for affecting change. So we need to undermine all the socializations, all the misconceptions, all the attitudes, all the barriers that have led us to perpetuate and reproduce systems of domination and oppression. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you for that broad and encompassing context in which we grapple with EDI issues. And thank you for providing that history and complicating the concepts and the language and the vocabulary as you have. You've provided us with an excellent and thorough overview of the issues, and I thank you very much for that. Participants in this event were provided the opportunity to propose questions for this portion of the program. And I've taken the liberty to highlight a few of those questions, but also to include my own. And I think that your summary at the end in terms of highlighting the importance of willpower, leadership, and infrastructure, and particularly the point that you stressed throughout your presentation that moving this change in our institution cannot fall on the shoulders of just one person or one office. And I think that there are a number of issues that you've raised, and one of them that has come to my attention just the other day is the idea of collecting data, and particularly race-based data. And there has, in my experience in education and institutions of higher learning, it seems like there's been like a real colorblind approach to data collection and a real reluctance as if, and so I'm wondering if you could talk more about race-based data and what are the challenges or the complexities or the dangers or the benefits of race-based data collection.
So thank you very much for that. So I'll begin. I'm from the Bahamas originally, so we have an expression which says, before I can tell you where I'm going, I have to tell you where I've been. And so in this case, one of the reasons I quite deliberately stressed the 1984 Abella Report, Royal Commission, the 1985 Employment Equity Act, in the 1986 Federal Contractors Program. I should have mentioned that there is now an employment equity review panel that's headed by Professor Adele Blackhead of McGill, which is looking at renovating the Employment Equity Act, so Abella Redux, and also the question of data. So one of the tasks of that group was to make sure LGBTQ2+ are added into employment equity as an official or fifth equity deserving group. So the question is, we have gender-based data, binary, and increasingly more complex. Women, gender is one of the equity group. If our claims about data sensitivity, confidentiality, privacy were true, it would be for all equity groups. So why is, and I give that example it's because we have normalized checking boxes that say male, female, non-binary. And now we have normalized taking out male, female, saying women, men, and other, okay? Human rights legislation, Canadian Human Rights Commission allows for it. The charter allows for it. The charter, and it says you can do these kinds of things if you are trying to ameliorate these inequities. That's what's laid out clearly. Now, this question of race-based data, I look at people and I'm like, we've learned through COVID-19, the pandemic, the disproportionate impact. Saskatchewan was releasing data on women and age, which is what they collected. And then they found out that people wanted to know what was happening with racialized minorities, immigrants, what was happening on reserves, what was happening with urban Indigenous peoples, homeless peoples. And they didn't have the data. The data were essential to developing strategies to combat COVID. They didn't have it. So they started crowdsourcing. I think that has actually, so that experience has helped to unsettle this idea around the necessity of this kind of data. We see also with racial profiling, disproportionate impact on Indigenous people and Black people. The data help us to see those gaps. So now in universities, the question is, why can't we collect this data to see the disproportionate impact or put in the racialized wage gap? There are no serious obstacles to collecting this data for racialized minorities, disaggregated, similar to StatsCan. There are no human rights obstacles to collecting Indigenous data. There's a charter, chapter 9 of the Tri-Agency on around Indigenous data sovereignty and protocols to follow, but there's no inherent obstacle to collecting it to see how First Nations, Métis, Inuit are doing. Otherwise, universities can say Maori, Native American, Ainu from Japan, they can use that data to say we are closing the gap, right? So you need data to help you understand the experiences of racialized minorities in university. And it's not a colorblind approach. It's actually no approach to collecting race-based data. There's also zero approach to collecting disabilities data. People say, oh, it's too sensitive. It's not sensitive. It's sensitive for persons with disabilities, maybe if they think they were going to be harmed by the collection of the data, if they think obstacles are going to be denied to them. So you will find that people who are persons with disabilities are more likely to fill out accommodation forms requiring accommodations than they are to fill out the self-ID forms. So there's a gap between those two sets of data. One is confidential, the other is they self-ID, people are afraid they will be disadvantaged. So we do need data for each of the equity deserving group. And if we are not collecting the data for each of the groups, that is a structural obstacle put in the way of achieving equity. Data are necessary to achieve equity. You're not collecting it. You cannot claim anything serious about ameliorating racial inequity. And so I will stand by that. There are concerns that of the misuse of that data. And that's just true. That's why we do ethics surveys. That's true for all equity groups, actually, but women, racialized minorities, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, those kinds of ethical concerns are true for each of the equity deserving groups, and no different, in my view, for racialized group. People do not want to be data collected and be used as some kind of checkbox for university. If it's being used to ameliorate inequities, to transform people's lives so they can flourish, there's a different conversation that's had.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I can say it strongly enough. It is the one thing, one of the main things I've been emphasizing at Youth Calgary. We have an EDI dashboard that's public facing. We have developed infographics that we share the data. We have a new employment census, and we're going to be launching a student census at the end of the month. And we are doing this because we act as an accountability measure. If we don't have the data, we are not accountable to ourselves, and the students, faculty, and staff in the broader community cannot hold us accountable. So denying data is a way of being unaccountable.
Thank you very much for that response, Dr. Smith. I'll be returning to this recording, and because this is a question that has come up in another context, and I think others really appreciated that slide towards the end of your presentation, the sins.
Yeah.
The sins of diversity, and I think this is another theme that has come through, is that systems require systemic change, and you've highlighted how these offices of EDI or these positions of special advisor on anti-racism tend to be like a single person or a single office. And so how do we begin to build that infrastructure that you're calling for in your talk?
This is actually a hugely important question. And so one of the ways I get into this question is I say to universities, especially research intensive. So I push even harder at those of us who are part of the U15, where we get 70% of the national research dollars. We get lots of innovation grants. We insist that we need to do the research to better understand a problem, develop solutions, and to move on in every area. That is no different for EDI. So let's just take, so what kind of infrastructure you need? Well, you need data. So if the Office of Institutional Analysis is not collecting it, is it HR collecting it? Who's collecting it? What is the census that we are using? Well, doing a survey is not hard. We have sociologists, political scientists, economists doing surveys all the time. Research intensive universities do surveys. We have the StatsCan census. We can model something like that. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. If another university is doing it, we can borrow it. Okay, we know how to do research. So we need we need data analysts. That was the first hire I made at UC. We need education and literacy. So I gave the whole thing about the EDI vocabulary, the problem of the acronym, the uses and abuses of certain concepts, the need to have a kind of a vocabulary, the ABCs of EDI, A, D, that's not just used in the office or on a website, but that is part of the common vocabulary, the consensus building. But that language actually shapes policy. It leads to the changes you want to effect. And if people have a different understanding, so if some people think diversity is white genocide, That is a literacy problem, an education problem that the office somebody has to address. So do you have the appropriate number of education people doing this work? Who's going to be doing all the anti-bias workshops? You have to try agencies calling for it for research grants, the CRCs, for example. If you have to do it for hiring, who's going to do that? Well, how many bodies do you need to do that? Notice I'm just saying EDI generally. I haven't even talked about anti-racism. I have tracked all the anti-racism advisors that are emerging across the country. They are identified as individuals. They may be advisor to a provost, they may be advisor to a president, but they are individual. I don't know how often those people meet with these leaders. I don't know what infrastructure they have to develop policies. I don't know if they have even an EA or an assistant to help them schedule events. Who's writing their speeches? Who's helping them do the research for their presentations? I do some of this and it is time consuming. Mm-hmm. So do we want toolkits? Either the individual does it or you hire people to do it. Now you could hire students, so you could student employment. You could hire postdocs, you could hire consultants. But when you start mapping out specifically the kinds of work that you need to get done, then you start to say, well, do we have a person who does EDI strategy? Who's going to develop our strategies? Anti-racism strategy. Who's going to develop the, do you have an anti-racism policy? So I look at the Review 15, we don't have anti-racism policies. We don't have anti-racism procedures. Do you need a policy, a procedure? Then you need somebody who's going to adjudicate it. What's the infrastructure for adjudicating those? Who's going to define racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, different forms of racism, institutional, systemic, cultural? You see there that those are research initiatives. What is the nature of the problem, the incidence of racism on campus? Do you have focus groups? Do you have to do an informal survey to find out how people feel? Is it going to be done internally or are you going to get a consultant to do it? Either way, and you ask those questions for disabilities, we are much better at student accommodations than we are at staff or faculty. LGBTQ, I said to people, I hear a lot of the G word. I even hear the T word. You never hear the L word except on TV, Netflix maybe. I said the bi word. That's an acronym. That's not who people are. That's not the experiences of members of this community in the university. When you think of each of these areas, the knowledge that's warranted in order to affect change, one individual, no matter how smart and talented, cannot do that work. And to ask one individual to do it is patently unfair. It is trying to use an autobiographical solution to confront a systemic problem. And systems replicate. So it's not just the HR system, it's the legal system. It's the admissions. It's also the promotion and advancement. It's the selection, adjudication systems. If you're trying to change all these, one individual cannot do it. And that begs the question then is, when universities do these appointments and these hirings, even I would say even in my case in the office, very little thought goes into the infrastructure necessary to support the success of the office so that it doesn't lead to backlash, it doesn't lead to frustration, and it doesn't lead people to say, oh, that's just a show and tell. And my view is one way to discredit such offices and finding is actually to under-resource them, actually to remind people of how insignificant they are, that they don't even have staff to actually get the work done, which means then you end up with the talk and not the action. So we need to take seriously EDI infrastructure, anti-racism infrastructure, and not put the onus on an individual to carry the weight of the institution.
Right. That's very thorough response, Dr. Smith. And one of the issues that I've tried to raise in the university context is just the minimal offerings, even at the graduate level, of anti-racist education in the universities. And we've been engaged in doing a scan of the U15 universities and looking at the small place that anti-racist education plays in the academy. So if we think about moving forward on racial justice, we need the education, and we need the faculty and the graduate students who can provide and develop their own scholarship in this area. And so the next question is about research. And this is this question comes from a person registered in the program. So how can researchers fulfill EDI into research, like that it's not as a section of a research proposal that wins funding and gets forgotten, but as a daily practice in their lab, their field, or their research program? And I know recently Social Science Humanities Research Council has put out a call for to fund research in critical race studies, and that's really a welcome change and move. And so I'm just, because I know a few years back I was part of a collective that proposed research that would mobilize the existing knowledge we have on race in Canada. And you know, I mean, of course it was denied, and we could say it was denied for multiple kinds of reasons, but how do we integrate EDI substantially and meaningfully into our research programs?
Thanks for that. It's one of the issues I grapple with in my own work, because I'm also AVP research, EDI. Calgary is working on EDI. So just today we sent out to our senior leadership the draft proposal for EDI, a pilot EDI plan in EDI in research and teaching and learning awards. So it's a little piece of the whole ecosystem, because I think you also need in teaching, learning, and research and scholarship. So yes, as part of a proposal, you can think about, I actually think about it from the constitution of the research question. And I think about Eleanor Ostrovsky was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, I think, in economics. And when she was invited to, when she was to the table, she asked questions about household and household income and these kinds of questions that, had she not come to the table and brought a gendered lens, might not have been asked. And so in a way, when you're thinking about that, is I think I'm a staunch advocate of diversity of teams, diversity of leadership teams, diversity of research teams. And when I said that, I don't mean people immediately switch to diversity of perspectives. And my view is diversity of perspectives also comes from one's lived experiences. And that, and because the diversity of perspective sometimes can be used to maintain homogeneity, right? You asked, so the questions we asked, the methodologies we asked, the ways of knowing, the lens we use, the way we understand research assessment. So do we use the DORA assessment or research, or do we use the H-index? Do we focus on journals? Do we do books? Do we look at the venues? Or so it's a book. So H-index doesn't even really monitor book chapters. And so then the ways in which the social science, humanities, fine arts research gets calculated is always seen as a disadvantage in relation to NSERC kinds of research or CIHR. So there's a disciplinary bias at the structural level to that kind of funding. But from our undergraduate training of students who gets tapped, who gets research awards, student research awards, to our graduate ones who gets put forward for SSHRC master's graduate or SSHRC postdocs or Banting or Vanier's or the Trudeau fellowships, who gets put forward for these kinds of things. And you start to track, and again, data, do we have data? So I've looked at the things that we should have data for, like the awards, for example. You know, awards tend to follow awards like a certain kind of pipeline. Well, who gets put forward to those? And you see increased demand. Like, why are these people? Why are they this? It's a cookie cutter look. But there's something that's more fundamental about knowledges, and that's the kind of stuff that we're getting at with the EDID, with the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences. It is which kinds of knowledges are centered, and that's knowledges from 6 countries in Europe. If you're in the social science and humanities, 6 countries in Europe, that is a colonial edifice to which Indigenous ways of knowing are responding to, but all as well non-Western knowledges. Can Asians think? Can Africans think? Then where, if they can think and they publish, where is the scholarship in our curriculum? So there's a connection here between what we study, the ways in which disciplines discipline us to privilege certain knowledges, and to marginalize and subordinate various others. And so when I think of the EDI in the research ecosystem, it is thinking at the micro level, everything from citational practices. You look at all the papers we have published and decide whether we are actually committed to diversity or inclusion in our citational practices. Look at the venues we use. And what do the venues tell us about not just what we privilege, what our disciplines privilege and what our universities privilege. And then you start to see the challenges at the micro, meso, but also the systemic level in terms of transforming the research ecosystem. So awards by SSHRC can help with that, but institutions need to do it. And my view is our ranking systems are all structured around a certain way of doing things. And unless we are prepared to have a hard look at that, and I don't think we are there, anywhere near that, because the edifice, the foundation that we are on is grounded in this kind of inherited colonial structure. And we are only grappling with it now with some name changes, for example, University X, or Dalhousie's study of the structure of Lord Dalhousie, who got his money from slavery, or McGill, slavery money and colonial money also funded UBC. We are only just starting to grapple with these kinds of the structure of our practices, how they play out in teaching and learning, how they play out in curriculum, how they play out in research and scholarship, and the whole kind of disciplinary edifice that we are all disciplined into. So that's a long-term project, but it comes back to your prior question about the infrastructure to deal with this.
Yeah, thank you. That again covers a lot of ground in terms of your response and raises like a number of issues and concerns that I've been bothered by. And, you know, for example, even in terms of the move now to have research teams, and then without, and those can be problematic if we don't begin with a discussion of how we collaborate and, you know, just the groundwork that needs to be done in terms of building a common understanding of how we will work together. And how easy it is for those in a position of racial dominance to once again take over. And of course, the other issue that your response raised for me was just in terms of publications and where we publish, and the growing tendency these days to say that you have to publish in tier 1 journals, and doesn't necessarily mean for some of us that that's of value when we are trying to meet a broader and diverse audience and community. I have a final question, and that is in terms of what are the opportunities, where might opportunities for this focus on EDI at universities, and maybe even the University of Calgary, also strengthen relationships with Indigenous students, faculty, and staff? And Do you have thoughts or plans related to the intersectionality of EDI and TRC?
So this is ongoing. So let me say, one of the things I do in my life is I contribute a piece to the University Affairs from the administrative chair. And the first piece I did was very difficult, obviously finding time to write in the admin rule. And when I looked at I thought there were three major fault lines in universities. One, and I used the word fault lines quite consciously, because it was based on what I was hearing about what's happening across the country. One was the gender in EDI. So fault line, and the other was what was happening with EDI and indigenization. Was EDI undermining the ability of efforts to advance EDI? So people were putting it as either or, as binary, and as kind of zero sum. And so with my colleague, Michael Hart, who is the Vice Provost EDI, Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement, we have been engaged in a series of conversations, because Michael is responsible for the Indigenous strategy at Capitol, and also then works with the elders and the elder circles and the Indigenous advisory groups. And there's a whole number of Indigenous implementation groups which includes people from all backgrounds involved in trying to advance the Indigenous engagement. One of the things that happened when I arrived is that people started conflating EDI and Indigenous engagement, which is to say, and I jokingly, but half jokingly use, people would say, Michael and Malinda and Michael. I said, okay, we're not M and M. And it's not an Indigenous engagement and EDI. We have both tried to stress are not the same. There is a circle of overlap around, say, employment, educational experiences, climate. But Indigenous relations are nation-to-nation relationship. Reconciliation has a lineage and a genealogy outside the Employment Equity Act and infrastructure, and predates it. And we need to be mindful of that. So we are having conversations about how we collaborate around questions of decolonization, for example, and we're going to be actually launching 2 projects around local decolonization and its connection to international, the more global, right? So attention to place and territory, similar to the EDID work that I did with Marie Batiste and Florence Glanfield and that team at the Federation. But say we're talking the territory, Treaty 7 territory, or even more broadly, the prairies. That's one kind of work where it's practical and focused so people can see the similarities, but also the differences. We work around Dimensions EDI together about how the EDI and Indigenous engagement research ecosystem requires certain similarities, but also some fundamental differences around conducting research with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous data sovereignty, and other kinds of things, which are somewhat different from saying Indigenous peoples are just one of the other equity groups. Right. So, I mean, this is hard work. It requires careful relationships and care. And it requires also of trying to avoid dividing practices, which tries to pit, say, anti-Black and Indigenous peoples, says Black people and Indigenous people together, say, oh, if we do anything for anti-Black racism, it's going to harm Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples aren't saying that by and large. I mean, some might be anxious or concerned about how universities are doing it, but to say we need to be mindful of colonial strategies of divide and conquer, which don't advance the question of justice and fairness. So ultimately, you get to say is, how does this advance the humanity, the dignity, but also in the case of Indigenous people, land and territory questions are different than for, say, the members of other equity-seeking groups. So that's an education and literacy piece, we are framing it as, and that requires some research and knowledge and care in disseminating, which brings us back to the original questions about infrastructure to do that difficult work. And it is difficult work. And the question is, Do we want racialized and Indigenous peoples to carry the weight of the institutional change in that way without thinking about how sustainable it is and about the real risk of burnout and harm?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. And we have been carrying that burden, and we have paid a price. And I just appreciate the scholarship and the research and the thought that you have put into thinking about these really important issues. And as you concluded your comments, we are about acknowledging the humanity and dignity of people, Indigenous people and racialized people that has been denied. So thank you again.
Thank you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Malinda Smith, for your wonderful, inspiring, and thoughtful words. We truly appreciate you being here with us today and sharing your thoughts on how to go from talk to action. Thank you also to Dr. Verna St. Denis for moderating the Q&A and to President Stoichev for the introduction of Dr. Smith. I would now like to welcome Dr. Airini, Provost and Vice President Academic at the University of Saskatchewan, to provide some closing remarks. Dr. Airini joined the University of Saskatchewan in February of 2021. Her 3-decade career is defined by her leadership internationally and domestically in areas of equity and higher education, Indigenous advancement, and converting research and policy into improved education outcomes. Please welcome Dr. Airini.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Namarta and Kelly. Thank you, a huge thank you to the EDI Champions Network of the University of Saskatchewan. What an astonishing day. It has been inspired and inspiring. Thank you so much to each and every one of our speakers today. Bob Badger, thank you for beginning our conference in such a good way, and our singers with the Métis National Anthem. We heard a victory song and an anthem to begin our day together. Included in the words was the sentence, "With the past as motivation, all our dreams can be fulfilled." I am motivated thanks to today's conference, and I know you are too. Equity, diversity, and inclusion is our work together. And as our president said this morning, this is our work as a university, and as this university, we can imagine a new reality of equity, diversity, and inclusion. We can make this possible. Indeed, we must. My closing remarks for today are around 3 thoughts. What have we heard? What are the big ideas? And what now? I'm going to reflect on these questions, and I wonder if you would want to feel free at the same time, maybe just a little bit of multitasking, to take a moment to scan back on today's amazing program and to hear again the voices of those who prepared presentations for us and for those who spoke in the discussion rooms. Feel free to jot down in the chat box a few words, sentences that you remember from their words and sentences. Much respect and gratitude to our speakers today. So here are the thoughts that I would be jotting down in the chat box of what I remember from words. And I wonder if these are like yours. I look forward to seeing your jottings too. So from President Stoichev, we heard that this work around EDI began in the summer of 2019 and continues to this day. We heard that we all have a responsibility to bring the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion alive. And we heard that the words must be combined with actions. Our EDI strategy is to be the roadmap to this positive change. So he asked this big question, what will that roadmap say for the kind of urgent positive change that's needed? And the big idea that I heard from our president is that our university is the right place to lead this change, and we each now take the next steps together. We then heard from Dr. Angela Jaime. She took us through what it means to contemplate EDI as not about weak sauce and fluff, but about shifting the center. She asked us to think of spicy hot sauce instead of weak sauce, in terms of an EDI strategy and our actions. She said we should be uncomfortable when we do the work of EDI. It takes all of us together to do the work. So her questions were, how do we continue to push forward and just be better? How do we make sure this university is a place welcoming of Indigenous people and all people? So I'm wondering, what are your memories from Angela's presentation? Here are just a sprinkle of mine. I heard her say, we don't want a feel-good EDI policy. We want one that challenges and makes change. I heard her say it's the responsibility of each of us to challenge how we think, feel, and act. And like someone has written in the chat box, I heard about the bird in the cage as well, and that it's not just about freeing the bird, but it's about dismantling the cage. And we've heard that just now in our keynote speaker. She spoke too that it's not the role of Indigenous peoples to do the analysing and the work for EDI, and that Indigenous stand alone from EDI through their rights, place, history, narratives, and accountabilities. So we need to work together, respectful of this place, and to prevent, to end the million little cuts of oppression that stop us from moving forward. She said we need to be present. We have to be very present for EDI to make the change that's needed. Cheryl, Patty, and Angela spoke to the questions of what is happening now and next, and how can I and we be involved? And we heard the big ideas that we're committed to measurable outcomes and actions. Yes, to the call to data, data, data that we've heard in our keynote speaker. We heard that we're going through the final steps in creating the EDI strategy and action plan, and that we must make sure that our policies and strategies related to this work operate within a web, not silos. And once we are there with the policy, that is just the beginning. The real work begins after the approvals. Tasman spoke of some of that real work by asking that question and illustrating in her words what community empowerment is really about, and that we need representation and governance. We want to make change to the world around us, and we need people to care, to understand, empathize, and build communities and seek pathways of EDI. She spoke of the community of leaders around her that show that it's possible that a community of this sort can raise a community of leaders for EDI. And we have just heard from Dr. Malinda Smith with the discussion facilitated by Dr. Verna St. Denis. The main question that I heard being answered there was, how do we move from talk to action? And the big ideas that came across to me, and I see some of them coming through now in the chat box as well, thank you so much, everybody, is that the context for EDI is one of urgency. In the long shadow of residential schools and continuing colonial relations, in a time of global racial reckoning, continued sexual and gender-based violence, and uncertain futures, this is work of agency and urgency. A huge factor will be leadership. Yes, in the individuals, yes, in you, yes, in me, but together we have to be that force for change. Data is going to be so important for this. So is our ability to imagine and then enact a different sort of society. And that sort of society needs to say and take action on how it is intolerable and insensitive to wait for barriers to disappear. We need to be intentional. We need to intervene. To do that, equity is to be our foundation, not a topic, not a misunderstanding, not a recommendation. And from diversity, we will have the outcome of equity. So as I think in closing about today's session, I'm also thinking about how we're in a time of pandemic, and this was also spoken of. It should be that the pandemic has sapped us of our energy, diluted our desire to take on big changes needed to be the kind of university the world needs. It could have shut down our calling to do better. But instead, today's conference, to me, has confirmed that we have the ability to continue to rally our minds, our science, our research, our values, just as we have here in relation to the COVID, and we've made a haven of sorts here at the University of Saskatchewan. Can we now imagine this rallying of mind, science, values, and community to create a different kind of society as a university and live those values and practices of EDI as this university? So we're here now for the next challenge to make our university a place that shows how the world can live with respect for one another. This too, as with the pandemic, has an aura of being impossible. But for us, we clearly imagine EDI as possible. And we know from today that EDI at the University of Saskatchewan will not be about weak sauce and fluff. It's going to be about action, and it's going to be about outcomes. We can start in powerful ways anywhere. We can start personally. If someone says something offensive or excluding, we can speak up. We can say, let's be careful that our words are respectful of everyone. We can say, well, I've got to say that comment makes me feel uncomfortable. We can say, that's not how we do things here. We can start anywhere. But starting anywhere won't be enough if there is to be impact. And we've heard that today. We have to have powerful impact. The EDI strategy and actions must get us somewhere different than we are now. And that's an intentional combination of the interpersonal and the structural. So for all of us, the 300 plus who have attended today, I offer my heartfelt thanks to everyone who contributed to making this event a reality. And for those in our university community who know racism, harassment, oppression, I want to acknowledge that experience. And I want to say that it's wrong that it's happened here. And I want to say this EDI work alongside anti-racism work, the Learning Charter, Living Our Values, and our University Plan 2025. In all of this work, this is our shared relentless intention to interfere on unfair restriction in our university and our universities. I want to say that the weight for this change must not be on the shoulders of our Indigenous underrepresented colleagues and students. And Dr. St. Denis recognized this, that Indigenous peoples have carried the burden and paid the price. It is for all of us that we make our university respectful for all. We make the structural changes needed to eliminate the barriers. We can redefine what it means to be the university the world needs. So it's been important for me to be here today, and I thank the organisers. One of my 3 priorities as provost is indigenisation and equity, diversity and inclusion. And I want to let you know a few things that I see ahead. I see the University of Saskatchewan EDI action plan with measurable outcomes, yes. I see senior leaders, including myself, with clear EDI goals to close gaps and go beyond. I see infrastructure for EDI. I see EDI data and an associated data site that is public facing. I see someone responsible to find and follow the data around to make change. I see tactical research into indigenisation and EDI at the university. I see curriculum to move EDI and social justice forward. I see an evaluation of our policies to address barriers to EDI. And I see recognition and awards for successes in leading change in EDI. And finally, in the 10th item, I see respect for Indigenous rights, place, history, narratives. I wonder, will you help in this effort? Will EDI be a priority for you? If yes, contact me. Contact your dean, contact your unit leader. Let them know that you want to be part of the change. We have, as our President Stoichev said, the opportunity now to take the next steps together. This is a time of change, measured change, accountable change together. We began with the victory song and anthem, and this conference has been about mobilizing for victory for EDI at the University of Saskatchewan. With all our speakers, with our president, with our conference organizers, with everyone here, we know there is no better place than a university, no better place than this university to take these next steps, these personal, actual, data-informed, structural steps, these next steps for EDI. Thank you, everyone, for making our university, the University of Saskatchewan, the place of real change for equity, diversity, and inclusion. Thank you.
Dr. Airini, I cannot think of a better way to end the day than with the call to action to be part of the change. So thank you. Thank you for your reflections on the day, and thank you for the call to action. That's how we move from policy to implementation. So this concludes today's inaugural Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion event. Before I close officially, we will be inviting feedback before the end of the month. So please be sure to watch for this opportunity to share with us what went well today and what we can do to make this event even better next time. The work doesn't stop, and I think we are excited about continuing our commitment and taking action towards a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive University of Saskatchewan community. So on behalf of the organizing team, our sincere thank you to everybody who joined, and to the presenters who provided provocative, thought-provoking insights and comments throughout the course of the day. We are complete. Have a beautiful evening, everyone. Thank you.